Hello, this is Cryptolyze. I hope you are well on this Friday, 29 September 2023. It is with pleasure that I meet with you today to talk about lots of things, talk about BTC, talk about crypto, talk about SEC, talk about Coinbase, because the work that Coinbase is doing is quite extraordinary. It will have to support that. We're going to talk about monthly closing and BTC with the crazy thing that's making us the dollar. We're going to discuss all this, and it starts now. We start right away with the SEC, which postponed the BTC spot ETF from BlackRock, Valkyrie, and Bitwise. So there, it's obvious we expected it. It was something classic. It's postponed until January 10th. So it's the first postponement. I think there will be more others. And yes, because quite simply, there is a real fear of manipulation through spot ETFs, a fear which is founded or unfounded, which is perhaps simply an excuse not to validate a spot ETF. Nevertheless, what is certain is that this delay, which is proposed to have effect in relation to the discussion also yesterday of Gary Gensler before the Congress and the allegations which were made on whether Gary Gensler was not inclined to facilitate access to BlackRock, to upstream spot ETFs. Of Grayscale, because Grayscale lost the Gary Gensler lawsuit. Finally, the SEC lost the lawsuit against Grayscale. Yet the Grayscale ETF is still not validated. And in fact, one of the senators said that, are you doing this on purpose to put an ETF like BlackRock, a big player, before those who were there, precisely, who made their first request? So we are in a totally different approach, and strangely it happens the day after these public exchanges in which there is proof by deed saying, no, don't worry, it's not that. Yes, I think it's not that. I think it's much broader. It's quite simply, they absolutely don't want these ETFs. On the other hand, what do we have next? We potentially have the validation of future ETFs on Ethereum. Be careful, it's different in future and spot. What poses a problem is the ability to keep the BTC, to keep the asset and not to manipulate it, and to have traceability of the manipulation. And what's interesting is that this is a Fox source. Be careful. We're careful about that. It's not yet in blocks or things like that. So we're taking a little bit of step back from the information itself, but it would be logical for us to have the validation of future Ethereum ETFs, because that was the case on BTC. There is no interest. To go further, the spot is yet another decision. And I think that it is a decision which is purely political and unfounded. And that is why I say that we must really support the actions which are being carried out by Coinbase. Big actions that we saw even during the SEC, where we had precisely the small panels which were behind with the Coinbase shield, with this commercial action, which is really wake up, in which there is an information action with the American Congress, in which we clearly saw that there was a large amount of disinformation. So there is this notion of data, factual information on the use of crypto in America, that it is not only for fraud, that it is not to try to defraud. We are still very, very far from this dynamic. We are more in a notion of action. In short, it was still the moment to be able to address a group of senators who were gathered for the occasion. Thanks at least to Gary Hetzler, he served alongside in terms of the calendar. We still have little things which will fall today. We especially have in Europe the annual September IPC, which will be validated. 4-5 in the forecast. I think we risk having fluctuations in relation to that, but there will be relatively little impact on the markets. And we will see the PCE core, which will fall. So we have 0-2 potential in August consolidated, 3-9 consolidated the same. I think we will stay in the state. So we will have relatively few fluctuations. We will therefore have a Friday, which will be relatively flat, especially since we have China, which is completely off during this period, which is at the same time the monthly closing, which is very strongly impacted by a lot of things. So we're going to talk quickly about oil, in which we made a new high where we took liquidity from this zone, and then we were swallowed, but which is rather classic, in which we have our dynamics potential. Here from the T, retracement, retest for after UTAD. We keep that in mind. I think that we will have relatively little movement today in terms of oil. On the other hand, there is a risk of movement, perhaps a little more in terms of stocks. Actions, because we are at the monthly close, in which we have the second month in a row in the red with a month which is much more aggressive. We have clearly typed here the Fibonacci extension objective 1. It's interesting to see how respected it is, especially at the SP 500 level. SP 500, in which we are here in a retracement phase. Yesterday, we had a period that was relatively green to be able to breathe, and we see that we continue to breathe. I think we won't go here until the retest, that we won't go and treat the 4,400, but we are going to potentially retest the 4,380. Here we have a lot of liquidity that is on hold before being able to make a bearish continuation. Or a stagnation, that is to say something which could do like that. Either stagnate and have a relatively flat Friday to start again during Monday, or have precisely something which will push upwards at the start of the day and then push and either retest or break the lowest. It's always this dynamic for me. We continue to sink to get lower. Further down, this is not the case for DXY. We see that we have a series of green weeks. We continue to push very strongly, and we have actually broken this level with a big acceleration this week, which has been halved. Very important, what are we retesting here? We are in the process of retesting the classic part, first top, second top, third top, in which we are in the process of retesting this part. I think we will continue and then go for the 107. 107, which is a relatively important level in terms of the DXY. And what is interesting to see is that we have a rebound at the level of the Euro USD while we have a death cross on it. So I think that I will certainly talk about it in tomorrow's video to be able to explain a little to you this part in which we have a relatively strong impact. And what is interesting to see is that we are supposed to have a relationship between the DXY and the BTC. And we see that this decorrelation is also present on the DXY and the BTC, not only on the SPF 500. Moreover, at the level of BTC, the monthly closing, which is currently taking place, which will also close on Friday evening on the CME Sunday evening, on the rest of the prices on the total index, we are slowly moving towards at the level of the RSI towards the 50. We see that we have a small rebound, but overall we will be, I think, in a ranging zone in terms of momentum because we have a momentum, which is relatively, but we will talk about it in tomorrow's video. Then, in the short term, we see that we have a very large candle which fetched a lot of liquidity, which recreated new liquidity for us with an equal high, which remained. So we have our divergence, which is present here, bearish divergence, in which we have our equal high, which is set up with a very big acceleration. I was just telling you yesterday that the bearish movement was not strong enough, clearly, the fact that we did not break there. It was either the establishment of a construction with or an upward burst. That was a bit of the idea that I had, and that's why we had drawn up this extension of time, this which still brings us into our target still at 28,600, a very important target in which we have our retest and order block, which for me potentially represents a bearish continuity. Okay, so if we manage to tap into this liquidity there will potentially be a nice entrance to make. A bearish continuity. We see that at the level of the RSI, we are already and immediately in an overbought zone, which is rather classic. So I think that we will have a breathing, short-term breathing, which should be represented by a retest here of the top ranging zone. If we ever reintegrate, we will have something that will be much more aggressive with something that will do like that. There we will in fact have a potential signal to look lower and go. Look for that low there. On the other hand, if we have a very good retest like that and we re-enter and we leave there, we have a very good signal to potentially accompany until the 28,600. That's a bit the short-term target that I have to know that it is Friday as usual Friday. We have a crush of volatility at the moment, so we will potentially have something which will zone and zone something which will do something like that, or even perhaps a little bearish or a little bit bullish, but it will matter. The goal will be to create liquidity. Moreover, in terms of this momentum, what did it create in terms of order flow? Very interesting is that we found ourselves in a pure contraction of the order flow, whether at the level of all the accounts or here of all the accounts of the top traders. We see that we left again, but overall we are in a phase of contraction where there is an uncertainty that is taking place, a 50 minus 50. We remember that the closer we get of 50, the more we are in a phase of ranging, the more we are in a phase of non-flow and therefore of non-direction. And this is very clearly seen in terms of the funding rate. In terms of open interest, we remain relatively low. Overall, we still remain above the 90, but below the 100, despite the movements that are made. What is interesting to see about the clean crack is that we went to get all the liquidity that was there and that there was a particularly perp movement. Okay. It's perpetual, so implied. It's not a spot movement. It's a movement which is linked to levers. When we don't have volatility, we create levers to create what? Well, liquidity, that's a bit of what happened. We liquidated a small part of liquidity, but we strengthened upper liquidity and we strengthened lower liquidity, okay, which is completely classic with momentum here. Why am I telling you that we can go quite high, quite quickly? Because the equal high, which is put in place here, we see it very clearly here in terms of liquidity, where we always have this block of liquidity very present. So for me, at least an acceleration to go and break this high seems completely coherent to me. That is to say, an acceleration to go and get that high, to go and recover the equal high which was left here. And then we will ask ourselves the question, are we going to look for immediately the upward acceleration for the 28,600, or are we going to have a breather in the meantime in which we will do a retest and then an upward acceleration? Something that could do this, that we zone here, and then we start to rise again. These are always the elements that I have short term. Personally, I am still in my bearish bias in which we continue the flow here. We are no longer in a breathing phase. Here we start to draw it, to see it, something that could look like this before tapping into this retest zone to make a bearish continuity, which would be completely logical in a three-stroke dynamic in which we would have breathing in a zone of 23,000 that we expect 23,000 up to overall 19,000. That doesn't change. For me, I have no invalidation as long as I do not have strong news, as long as I do not have strong impulse candles there. That is not the case. It is only perpetual. It is only hunt for liquidity. The big question is whether we are not stuck in a very large range in which we will oscillate for several months until generally January, February. And the fact that we are having a discussion, an acceptance or refusal, or even why not an extension of these ETFs, which are clearly endogenous elements and potentially action by the SEC, on the rest of the cryptos, that is really the part which is very strong, and we do not forget the regulatory part, which should soon come out at the level of the USA, which could settle these issues, which could give a new dynamic or sink the BTC, whether it is one or the other. But in this case, we are still relatively far from having these answers right away. We will have to once again in passion. We'll meet again on Sunday, October 1st at 18. We'll meet up for a live on YouTube directly. It's been a long time since I've done one. It'll be a pleasure that I'll meet you again, and we'll meet again at 13:30 for Ghost.